My name is Marissa Hayes, am 34 years old, and am standing in a courthouse hallway watching my parents comfort my younger sister Brooke as she holds a screaming baby. The baby, my husband's daughter, wails while Brooke rocks her with exaggerated distress, her eyes red from crying. My parents glare at me with a hatred so pure it takes my breath away. My hands shake as I clutch a manila folder against my chest, the contents inside representing months of investigation, sleepless nights, and a truth so devastating it will shatter everything they think they know. They have no idea what I'm about to say in that courtroom. Behind me, the bailiff opens the heavy wooden door and calls our case number, his voice echoing through the marble corridor, and as I turn to walk inside, a memory flashes through my mind. Thanksgiving dinner 9 months ago, the moment my entire world exploded, and the 9 months of absolute hell that followed. Before we dive into what happened in that courtroom, I'd love to know where you're watching from. Drop your city or country in the comments below. And if you're ready to hear how I took down the people who betrayed me most, hit that like button and subscribe, because this story has more twists than you can imagine. Trust me, you won't want to miss what happens next when the judge finally hears my side of the story. I had been married to Garrett Hayes for 6 years when everything fell apart, and looking back now, I can see all the signs I deliberately ignored because I wanted so desperately to believe in the life we'd built together. We met during my senior year at the University of Washington, where he was finishing his MBA and I was completing my nursing degree, and from the very first conversation at that crowded campus coffee shop, he seemed like everything I'd ever wanted. Charming without being sleazy, ambitious without being cutthroat, attentive in a way that made me feel seen for the first time in my life. He worked in commercial real estate after graduation, one of those jobs that sounds impressive at dinner parties, and I became a pediatric nurse at Seattle Children's Hospital, a position that demanded everything from me emotionally but gave me a sense of purpose I'd never found anywhere else. We bought a beautiful craftsman home in the Ballard neighborhood, the kind with original hardwood floors and a front porch perfect for morning coffee. And from the outside, we looked like we had it all figured out. My parents, Richard and Patricia, had always favored my younger sister Brooke in that subtle way that families pretend isn't happening even when everyone knows it is. Brooke was 6 years younger than me, 28 to my 34, and she'd spent her entire adult life finding herself in a way that really meant bouncing from job to job while our parents funded her lifestyle and made endless excuses for her failures. I was the responsible one. The child who never caused problems, who got good grades and made sensible choices and never asked for money or bailed on family dinners at the last minute with some dramatic excuse about a personal crisis. This dynamic created a resentment in me that I tried to bury under layers of understanding and sisterly support, telling myself that everyone's path was different and that Brooke just needed more time to figure things out. But the truth was that I resented how easy her life was compared to the constant pressure I felt to be perfect. Garrett seemed to get along well with my family, showing up to every holiday dinner and birthday celebration, helping my father with home improvement projects and listening patiently to my mother's long stories about her book club drama. And I thought that meant we were building something solid and permanent. What I didn't know was that Garrett and I had been trying to have a baby for 2 years, going through the exhausting cycle of fertility treatments, hormone injections, disappointments that arrived with my period every month, and emotional strain that slowly eroded the foundation of our marriage in ways I was too desperate to see. Garrett became distant about 8 months before everything exploded, working late constantly, seeming distracted whenever we were together, always keeping his phone face down on the table in a way that made my stomach turn even though I told myself I was being paranoid. I attributed all of it to work stress, because that's what you do when you're terrified to look at the truth directly, and I threw myself even deeper into my job at the hospital, picking up extra shifts and volunteering for the most difficult cases, because at least there I knew how to help. At least there I felt competent and needed. Then came Thanksgiving dinner at my parents' house, and the revelation that would destroy not just my marriage, but my entire concept of family, loyalty, and who I could trust in this world. Thanksgiving dinner was held at my parents' suburban home in Tacoma, the same house where Brooke and I had grown up, and everything seemed normal in that forced way family gatherings always are when people are hiding things beneath pleasant conversation. Brooke seemed nervous throughout the meal, barely touching the turkey and stuffing, pushing food around her plate, while my mother asked her pointed questions about her latest job at a boutique clothing store, and I noticed but didn't think much of it because Brooke was always dramatic about something. After dinner, while everyone else settled into the living room to watch football and digest, Brooke pulled me aside and asked if we could talk privately, her voice shaking in a way that made me think she was going to ask for money again or confess that she'd gotten fired from yet another job. We walked out to the backyard where the old swing set still stood, rusted and unused, and I remember thinking how cold it was, how the November air bit at my skin, and how I wished Eid grabbed my jacket before following her outside. Brooke stood by the swings crying, her whole body shaking, and she could barely form words through the sobs. And my first instinct was concern, because despite everything, she was still my little sister, and Id spent a lifetime trying to protect her from the consequences of her own choices. When she finally managed to say, "I'm pregnant," my immediate reaction was happiness for her, genuine joy that she was finally going to have something stable and important in her life. And I started asking questions about the father and whether she was excited and offering to help her however she needed. Then Brooke said 4 words that stopped time completely. "It's Garrett's baby." I literally couldn't process what she was saying at first because the words made no sense together, like she was speaking a foreign language or like my brain was refusing to translate the meaning, and I made her repeat it 3 times before the reality crashed over me like a wave that knocked me completely off my feet. The explanation that followed was worse than the revelation itself, because Brooke claimed it just happened as if pregnancy was something that occurred accidentally, without any choices or actions leading up to it. She said it started 4 months earlier when she needed help moving from one apartment to another, one of those frequent moves she made whenever she decided she needed a fresh start, and Garrett had volunteered to help on a day when I was working a double shift at the hospital. According to Brooke, they'd grabbed beers after moving her furniture, started talking about how stressed they both were, and one thing led to another in that passive way. People describe conscious decisions when they want to avoid responsibility. One time turned into multiple times, secret meetings while I was at work or running errands, and Brooke sobbed through the whole confession, saying, "I didn't mean for this to happen. I'm so sorry," as if her remorse somehow erased the deliberate betrayal that had been happening right under my nose for months. I confronted Garrett immediately, finding him in my parents' living room watching football like nothing was wrong, and when I pulled him outside and asked if it was true, he didn't even try to deny it. His defense was somehow even more insulting than the affair itself, because he actually tried to blame me, saying, "You were always at work." Brooke needed someone as if my dedication to my career was permission for him to sleep with my sister. He claimed I'd been emotionally unavailable during our fertility struggles, that I was obsessed with getting pregnant and had stopped seeing him as a person and only viewed him as a means to have a baby, and the fact that there was a tiny grain of truth in his accusations made them cut even deeper. We had a massive fight right there in my parents' driveway, screaming at each other while neighbors' curtains twitched, and I told him to get out of my life, that I was done, that I never wanted to see him again, and he actually seemed relieved, like I'd freed him from some burden he'd been carrying. What shocked me more than anything was my parents' reaction when I went back inside, expecting support and finding only more betrayal. My mother looked at me with something close to pity and said, "These things happen. Families need to support each other," as if my husband impregnating my sister was just an unfortunate accident like a fender bender in a parking lot. My father added, "Brooke needs help now. She can't do this alone," with absolutely no acknowledgement of what had been done to me, no recognition that I was the victim in this situation, no anger directed at the 2 people who had destroyed my marriage and my family in one fell swoop. They actually expected me to be understanding, to put aside my pain and focus on supporting Brooke through her pregnancy. And when I refused, when I said I couldn't even look at either of them right now, my mother called me selfish and my father said I was being dramatic and making everything about myself. No one asked how I felt. No one held Garrett or Brooke accountable, and all the sympathy and support immediately flowed to my sister, like she was the victim of some tragedy rather than an active participant in one of the worst betrayals imaginable. I filed for divorce the Monday after Thanksgiving, walking into a lawyer's office with red eyes and shaking hands, and Garrett didn't fight it at all, signing papers with an eagerness that suggested he'd been waiting for an excuse to end things long before his affair with Brooke gave him one. I moved out of our Ballard Craftsman because I couldn't afford the mortgage on my nurse's salary alone, and Garrett certainly wasn't offering to help with anything. So, I rented a tiny one-bedroom apartment in Capitol Hill that cost too much and had paper-thin walls and windows that didn't quite close all the way. The divorce was finalized within 3 months because Washington is a no-fault state and we had no children and minimal shared assets. Or at least that's what Garrett claimed when he swore under oath that he had virtually no savings and couldn't afford to give me anything beyond splitting the furniture and household items we'd accumulated over 6 years of marriage. My parents stopped calling me entirely after that Thanksgiving confrontation, but they called Garrett regularly according to mutual acquaintances who felt obligated to keep me updated on the situation whether I wanted to hear it or not. I discovered through a former colleague that my mother was taking Brooke to all her prenatal appointments, going to ultrasounds and helping her pick out baby furniture, creating this whole narrative of a grandmother excited for her first grandchild without any acknowledgement that this grandchild was the product of adultery and betrayal. My father was paying for all of Brooke's prenatal care, expensive appointments with a high-risk OB, even though there was nothing actually high-risk about the pregnancy, and I found out later he was also paying her rent and giving her a monthly allowance so she wouldn't have to work during the pregnancy. I tried to talk to them once, about 6 weeks after Thanksgiving, calling my mother and trying to explain how much I was hurting, how abandoned I felt, how I couldn't understand why they were supporting the people who had destroyed my life. My mother's response was, "Accidents happen, the baby is innocent," as if the baby's innocence somehow negated the guilt of the adults who created the situation. And then she added, "You're being selfish, thinking only of yourself," which was such a stunning reversal of reality that I actually laughed out loud on the phone. My father got on the line and said essentially the same thing, that I was making this all about me, when I should be thinking about family, and about an innocent child who needed support, and I realized in that moment that I had fundamentally misunderstood who my parents were and what I meant to them. This was the first major attack on my character, painting me as the villain in a story where I was clearly the victim. And it wouldn't be the last. Extended family took sides quickly, and most sided with Brooke in that predictable way people always support whoever seems most vulnerable regardless of what actually happened. My Aunt Carol called to tell me that Brooke was going through such a hard time and really needed her family, with absolutely no mention of what I was going through, or any recognition that Brooke's hard time was entirely of her own making. My cousin Jennifer, who had been close with growing up, stopped returning my texts after I tried to explain my side of the story, and I found out later that my mother had called her and painted me as vindictive and cruel for abandoning my sister in her time of need. The only person who stood by me unconditionally was my best friend Simone Reed, a corporate attorney I'd known since college, who told me point-blank that this was going to get much worse before it got better, and that I needed to document everything. The baby was born in June, a girl they named Lily, and I heard about it through social media rather than any direct communication, because by that point, it'd been completely cut off from my family. The photos showed my parents at the hospital cradling their granddaughter, Garrett playing proud father, and Brooke looking exhausted but radiant in that way new mothers do, and the comments section was full of people congratulating them and calling them a beautiful family. I had been completely erased from the narrative, edited out of my own family like it never existed. And when I tried to feel something about having a niece, all I felt was a hollow numbness where my emotions used to be. I blocked them all on social media that day, deleted their numbers from my phone, and tried to move forward with my life by throwing myself into work and going to therapy twice a week with Dr. Helen Wu, who helped me understand that I was grieving multiple losses at once: my marriage, my family, my identity as a daughter and sister, and my entire sense of how the world worked. The legal theory was absurd, something Bradford Mills, the expensive family law attorney my parents had hired, had cobbled together from various precedents that didn't actually apply to this situation, but the fact that it was absurd didn't mean it wasn't dangerous. Brooke was suing me for $1,200 a month in child support, claiming that Garrett's reduced income meant he couldn't adequately support Lily, and since I had supplemented their lifestyle during our marriage through my nursing salary, I should continue to contribute to ensure his child had the same opportunities she would have had if the marriage had continued. I called Simone immediately after reading through the documents 3 times, each read, making me more furious and panicked, and she was appalled but not surprised, telling me that she'd seen desperate attorneys try increasingly creative legal theories when they knew they had wealthy clients willing to fund aggressive litigation. What made it worse was discovering that my parents were bankrolling the entire lawsuit, paying Bradford Mill's retainer that probably ran into 5 figures, funding this attack on me financially, while simultaneously funding it emotionally, by convincing Brooke she was entitled to my money. Bradford Mills had a reputation in the Seattle legal community as someone who would take any case if the check cleared, someone who specialized in scorched-earth family law tactics that left everyone damaged regardless of the outcome, and the fact that my parents had chosen him specifically told me everything I needed to know about their intentions. The pretrial meetings were absolutely brutal, worse than I'd imagined, because Bradford Mills was extraordinarily skilled at painting me as a vindictive ex-wife who was punishing an innocent baby for the sins of the adults. He claimed in deposition that I had fled the marriage instead of trying to work through our problems like mature adults, suggesting that if I'd been more willing to forgive and communicate, none of this would have happened. He dug into my work schedule at the hospital, implying that my dedication to my career had contributed to Garrett's infidelity, that I'd essentially abandoned my marriage emotionally, and was now shocked that my husband had sought comfort elsewhere. Every question was designed to make me defensive, to make me look cold and heartless, and I had to sit there and take it while a court reporter documented every word for the official record. Brooke played the struggling single mother role perfectly, bringing baby Lily to every single meeting, even though she could have easily left the baby with our parents, using the child as a prop to generate sympathy and make me look like a monster for not cooing over the baby who represented my husband's infidelity. She cried on cue during depositions, talking about how difficult her pregnancy had been, how scared she was about raising a child alone, how she'd tried so many times to apologize to me, but I refused to even acknowledge her existence. She never once showed real remorse or took genuine responsibility, instead framing everything as a tragic accident that had happened to her rather than a series of deliberate choices she'd made over months. Garrett's testimony in his deposition was perhaps the most infuriating because he genuinely seemed to believe his own lies about me being cold and career-obsessed. He described me as someone who viewed him as a means to an end, someone who only cared about having a baby and didn't care about him as a person, and he portrayed his affair with Brooke as an emotional connection that naturally became physical rather than what it actually was, a betrayal of both his wife and his sister-in-law. He claimed Head found warmth and understanding with Brooke that I'd never provided, painting himself as the real victim in all of this, and the worst part was that I could see how a judge or jury might believe his version of events if they only heard his side. My parents submitted character statements against me that were devastating to read, not because they contained anything truthful, but because they revealed how completely they'd rewritten history to make me the villain. My father, Richard, wrote that I had always put myself first, that I'd been selfish and self-centered since childhood, that I'd never understood the importance of family obligations, and had always prioritized my career and personal ambitions over relationships. My mother, Patricia's statement was even worse, claiming that I'd changed after getting married, that I'd become cold and distant from the family, that she didn't recognize the daughter she'd raised and was ashamed of what I'd become. These were the second and third attacks on my character combined, coming from the people who should have protected me, and reading their words felt like being stabbed repeatedly while someone told me it was for my own good. Simone prepared our defense strategy, but the emotional toll of the lawsuit was absolutely devastating in ways I hadn't anticipated. The discovery process, where both sides exchange information and documents, revealed things I wish I'd never learned, including evidence that Garrett had cheated before, multiple times throughout our marriage, and that Brooke had known about at least some of these affairs and had covered for him, making her betrayal even more calculated and deliberate than I'd realized. This wasn't an accident or a moment of weakness. This was a pattern of behavior, a conspiracy between my husband and my sister that had been building for years, and I'd been completely blind to all of it. 2 weeks before the trial was scheduled to begin, I was finishing a shift at Seattle Children's Hospital when my phone buzzed with a Facebook message from someone named Kelsey Zimmerman, a name I'd never heard before in my life. The message was brief. "I have information about Garrett Hayes that you need to know. Can we meet?" Under normal circumstances, I would have ignored it as spam or some kind of scam, but something about the timing and the directness made me respond, and we arranged to meet the next day at a coffee shop in the Fremont neighborhood, where we'd both have some anonymity. Kelsey turned out to be a 26-year-old woman who worked as a real estate agent, professionally dressed and clearly nervous about this meeting, and what she told me over the next 2 hours changed everything about my case. Shed dated Garrett 2 years earlier, during my marriage, though Id had no idea, and had told her he was divorced, that his ex-wife was crazy and vindictive, all the classic lies cheaters tell when they're trying to justify their behavior. Their relationship had lasted 5 months before Kelsey discovered the truth accidentally when she ran into one of Garrett's actual co-workers who mentioned his wife, and when she confronted Garrett, had threatened her, saying he had connections in the real estate world and would destroy her career if she caused problems for him. Kelsey had backed off at the time, terrified of the threats and unsure what to do, but Shed kept evidence of their relationship, text messages where Garrett said he loved her, photos of them together at restaurants and hotels, receipts from trips they'd taken together that I had unknowingly paid for with our joint credit cards. Shed felt guilty about not coming forward sooner, especially after seeing news coverage of the lawsuit that painted me as the villain, and she wanted to help set the record straight, even though she was still somewhat afraid of what Garrett might do. But the real bombshell came near the end of our conversation when Kelsey told me that Garrett had another child, a son named Mason who was now 3 years old, the product of another affair with a woman named Brianna Porter. Garrett had completely denied paternity, refused to take any responsibility, and because Brianna was a single mother working 2 jobs and could barely afford rent, let alone expensive lawyers, Shed eventually given up trying to get him to pay child support. Kelsey had stayed in touch with Brianna over the years, connected by their shared experience of being manipulated and abandoned by the same man, and she gave me Brianna's contact information with permission to reach out. I called Simone immediately from the coffee shop parking lot, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold the phone, and she told me to get Brianna on board immediately, because this evidence could blow the entire case wide open. I called Brianna that evening and we met 2 days later at a park in Renton where she could bring Mason to play while we talked, and seeing that little boy broke my heart in ways I wasn't prepared for. He looked exactly like Garrett, same eyes and smile and mannerisms, and Brianna's story of abandonment and threats and financial desperation made me realize that I wasn't Garrett's only victim, I was just the most recent one. Brianna worked as a waitress at a chain restaurant and cleaned houses on weekends, cobbling together enough money to keep her and Mason fed and housed, but with nothing left over for anything else, and Shed tried to establish paternity through the courts when Mason was a baby. Garrett had hired expensive lawyers who dragged out the process with continuances and motions and demands for multiple DNA tests, making it so costly and time-consuming that Brianna eventually gave up because she literally couldn't afford to miss any more work for court appearances. Shed been raising Mason alone for 3 years while Garrett lived comfortably and denied his son's existence, and now he had the audacity to sue me for not supporting his other child with my sister. I asked Brianna if Shed be willing to testify at my trial, explaining that her story would prove Garrett's pattern of abandoning his children and only pursuing support when it was convenient for him, and she hesitated because she was terrified of retaliation. I promised that Simone would protect her legally and that I would cover any costs associated with her involvement, and after thinking about it for a few days, Brianna agreed because she wanted justice for Mason, wanted Garrett to finally be held accountable for at least one of his many betrayals. Simone filed emergency motions to include this new evidence, and Bradford Mills fought aggressively to exclude it, arguing that it was irrelevant to the current case and was just character assassination designed to prejudice the jury against his clients. The judge, Sandra Pemberton, reviewed the arguments and ruled that the evidence was admissible because it went directly to Garrett's credibility and established a pattern of behavior relevant to the claims being made. The ruling was a huge victory for us, but it also meant Bradford would come at me even harder during trial, knowing that his case was weaker than Head initially thought. During this same period, I discovered through the discovery process that Garrett had hidden assets during our divorce, something Id suspected but couldn't prove at the time. Financial records subpoenaed for the current lawsuit revealed offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands that Garrett had never disclosed during our divorce proceedings. Accounts that contained over $300,000 that should have been split between us as marital property. Even more damning, I found email chains showing that my father, Richard, who worked as a financial advisor, had helped Garrett set up these accounts and transfer money into them during our divorce, essentially helping him commit fraud against me. This was the fourth major attack I'd experienced. Financial manipulation and outright theft, carried out by my own father in conspiracy with my ex-husband. And the discovery made me physically ill. Simone immediately saw the implications and started building not just a defense against Brooke's lawsuit, but a countersuit for fraud, conspiracy, and emotional distress against all of them. The trial was scheduled to begin in 1 week, and I was terrified but also grimly determined because I finally had the evidence to prove what they'd all done to me. The King County Courthouse was an imposing building downtown, all marble and authority, and walking through those doors on the first day of trial felt like walking to my own execution, even though I was technically the defendant. The courtroom was packed with people, mostly family members who'd come to support Brooke, cousins and aunts and uncles who believed the narrative that I was the vindictive ex-wife punishing an innocent baby. I sat at the defense table next to Simone, feeling completely alone despite having a lawyer and being in a room full of people, and across the aisle sat Brooke with Bradford Mills, while my parents sat directly behind them in the first row, refusing to even look in my direction. Garrett sat a few rows back, looking confident and somewhat smug, like this was all just an inconvenience that would soon be resolved in his favor. Judge Sandra Pemberton entered and everyone rose, and she was a woman in her early 60s with steel gray hair and an expression that gave away absolutely nothing, and I found myself praying that she would see through the manipulation and lies to the truth underneath. Bradford Mills gave his opening statement first, and it was a masterclass in emotional manipulation designed to tug at heartstrings rather than present facts. He painted Brooke as a naive young woman who'd been seduced by her older brother-in-law, a man she trusted, and who now found herself abandoned and struggling to care for an innocent baby who deserved support from all the adults who'd contributed to her existence. He argued that I had benefited enormously from Garrett's income during our marriage, living in a beautiful home and enjoying a comfortable lifestyle, and that now I was refusing to ensure his children had the same opportunities simply out of spite and vindictiveness. The jury, 8 people who would decide my fate, looked sympathetic during Bradford's opening, several of them nodding along or glancing at baby Lily, who Brooke had brought to court despite there being no legitimate reason for a baby to be present during legal proceedings. Bradford concluded by saying that this case was about doing what was right for a child, about putting aside adult conflicts and petty grudges to ensure an innocent baby had the support she needed and deserved, and as he sat down, I could feel the hostility radiating from the jury toward me. Brooke testified first, taking the stand with red eyes and a trembling voice, and she cried throughout her entire testimony in a performance that would have been impressive if it wasn't so infuriating. She described how the affair with Garrett had started, claiming she'd been vulnerable after a difficult breakup, and that Garrett had offered comfort that gradually became something more. According to her version of events, things just happened between them despite her trying to resist, and Shed told me about the pregnancy right away, out of guilt and a desire to be honest, conveniently leaving out that Shed waited until she was several months along and showing before confessing. She talked about her difficult pregnancy, claiming Shed had no support and was barely surviving financially, showing photos of her tiny apartment that looked like something from a poverty documentary, even though I knew my parents had been funding her lifestyle. Bradford asked about my reaction to the pregnancy news, and Brooke testified that I'd been so angry and cruel that I'd cut off all contact and refused to even acknowledge that Lily existed, that Shed tried to apologize so many times but I wouldn't forgive her or show any compassion whatsoever. She claimed she understood why I was hurt, but couldn't understand why I would punish an innocent baby for the mistakes of adults, and by the time she finished testifying, several jury members were looking at me with open disgust. Garrett testified next, and his performance was more polished than Brooke's, less emotional but equally manipulative. He admitted the affair was wrong but claimed there were emotional reasons behind it, saying that our marriage had deteriorated over the previous year because I was obsessed with having a baby and he felt like nothing more than a means to an end. He described Brooke as someone who listened to him and understood him in ways I apparently never had, making their affair sound like an inevitable outcome of my failures as a wife rather than his deliberate choice to betray me. He claimed Head lost his job due to the stress of the divorce and was doing his best to support Brooke and Lily but simply couldn't manage it alone on his reduced income, and under Simone's cross-examination, he stuck to his story, denying any other affairs and calling Kelsey Zimmerman a liar with an agenda when she was mentioned. My father Richard testified as a character witness, and this was the sixth major attack, because hearing your own father describe you as cold, selfish, and career-obsessed to a courtroom full of people is a special kind of pain. He claimed I'd always put myself first, that I'd never understood the importance of family obligations, that I was refusing to help my sister purely out of vindictiveness and spite. He described Brooke as someone who'd made a mistake but deserved support and forgiveness, and he portrayed me as someone who held grudges and couldn't see past my own hurt to do what was right for an innocent child. My mother Patricia testified next with similar themes, sobbing as she said she didn't recognize her daughter anymore, that the Marissa Shed raised would have found it in her heart to help her sister, that she was ashamed and heartbroken by what I'd become. The pain of hearing my own mother say these things under oath, knowing they would be part of the permanent record, was almost unbearable, and I had to grip the edge of the table to keep from breaking down completely. The first day of trial ended with media coverage that was predictably brutal, local news stations running stories about the family torn apart by an unforgiving ex-wife, and the comments section on every article called me heartless, vindictive, and cruel. People who'd never met me and knew nothing about the real situation were weighing in with their judgments, saying things like, "Imagine punishing an innocent baby for the adult's mistakes, and some people care more about being right than doing right." And I went home that night and cried until I had no tears left. Simone called me around 10 p.m. and said, "Tomorrow we fight back, trust me on this." And I tried to believe her even though everything felt hopeless. Day 2 of the trial began with me taking the stand, and I wore a simple navy dress with minimal jewelry, trying to look professional and sympathetic without seeming like I was trying too hard. Simone started with gentle questions, establishing the timeline of my marriage to Garrett, our fertility struggles, the gradual distance that had grown between us that I'd attributed to stress rather than infidelity. I described the Thanksgiving revelation in detail, my voice shaking as I recounted how Brooke had pulled me aside and dropped a bomb that destroyed my entire world in the space of 4 words. I talked about confronting Garrett, about his refusal to take any real responsibility and his insistence on blaming me for his choices, about my parents' immediate defense of Brooke without any concern for what I was going through. The courtroom was completely silent as I testified, and I could see some of the jury members starting to look uncomfortable, their earlier sympathy for Brooke wavering as they heard the other side of the story. I described how no one had asked if I was okay, how no one had held Garrett or Brooke accountable for their actions, how I was expected to just accept what had happened and move on as if 6 years of marriage and a lifetime of sisterhood meant nothing. My voice broke when I said I was supposed to just accept it and move on, like I didn't matter, like my pain wasn't real or important, and I saw one of the female jurors wipe her eyes. Simone asked about the divorce and asset division, and I explained how Garrett had claimed he was essentially broke, how I'd received almost nothing from our marriage and had to start completely over, working extra shifts at the hospital to afford rent and therapy, while Garrett lived in a nice apartment and drove a new car on money that supposedly didn't exist. I testified that while Garrett was claiming poverty and inability to work, he was somehow maintaining a lifestyle that required significant income, and I asked the obvious question, where was that money coming from? Then Simone dropped the first major bomb by asking about Garrett's fidelity during our marriage, and despite Bradford's objection, Judge Pemberton allowed the question as relevant to Garrett's credibility and character. I testified about my suspicions, the distance and lies and phone calls that ended abruptly when I walked into the room, and admitted that I'd had no proof at the time, but had felt deep down that something was wrong. Simone then introduced evidence from Kelsey Zimmerman. Text messages between Garrett and Kelsey during our marriage, showing an affair, photos of them together at romantic dinners and hotels, and hotel receipts charged to credit cards that I had paid off without knowing what they were actually for. The impact on the courtroom was immediate and dramatic. Garrett's face went pale, and he leaned over to whisper urgently to Bradford Mills, while Brooke looked genuinely confused, apparently not having known about Kelsey or any of Garrett's other affairs. Simone asked if I'd known about this affair with Kelsey, and I testified, "No, I found out about it 2 weeks ago when Kelsey contacted me because she felt guilty about not coming forward sooner." Then I added, "Just like I found out about his son, Mason, who's 3 years old now." The gasps in the courtroom were audible, people whispering to each other while Bradford jumped to his feet objecting, but Judge Pemberton overruled him because this evidence had been properly disclosed during discovery. Simone asked me to explain, and I described meeting Brianna Porter and her son Mason. The child Garrett had abandoned and refused to support. The child had denied was even his, despite obvious physical resemblance. I testified that Brianna had tried to establish paternity and get child support, but Garrett had hired expensive lawyers to fight her, dragging out the process until she couldn't afford to continue. And now this same man who'd abandoned one child was suing me to support another while claiming he had no money. The hypocrisy was staggering and obvious, and I could see the jury's perception shifting in real time, their earlier sympathy for Brooke and Garrett evaporating as they realized they'd been manipulated. Simone asked about my parents' involvement in the financial aspects of my divorce, and I testified that my father Richard, who worked as a financial advisor, had helped Garrett hide assets in offshore accounts, essentially helping him commit fraud against me during our divorce. I said, "They helped him steal from me, and then they sued me to support his affair baby." And the simple directness of that statement seemed to hit harder than any elaborate argument could have. Bradford's cross-examination was aggressive and hostile, trying to paint me as bitter and vindictive, asking, "Isn't it true you're just trying to hurt your sister by bringing up all these irrelevant allegations?" I responded calmly, "My sister hurt me by sleeping with my husband for months while I was working to support our household. I'm trying to protect myself from further abuse." He tried again. "You call supporting an innocent child abuse?" And I looked him directly in the eye and said, "I call being sued by the people who betrayed me abuse. I call being blamed for their choices abuse. I call being erased from my own family abuse." Bradford tried to rattle me with questions about family obligation and doing the right thing for a child, but I was done being defensive. I said I had obligations and I met them. I was a good wife, a good daughter, and a good sister. They had obligations too, and they destroyed them. Bradford had no response to that, and after a few more attempts to get me to say something damaging, he gave up and I was excused from the stand. I felt simultaneously exhausted and empowered, like I'd finally been able to tell my truth after months of being silenced and vilified. Day 3 of the trial began with Simone calling Brianna Porter to the stand, and Brianna was clearly nervous, fidgeting with her hands and speaking quietly, but her testimony was devastating to Garrett's case. She described meeting Garrett at a commercial real estate conference in Portland, where she'd been working as a caterer, how Head told her he was divorced and Shed had no reason to doubt him, how their brief relationship had resulted in her pregnancy. When she told Garrett she was pregnant, Head completely denied the baby was his, refused to take a paternity test, and threatened legal action if she pursued him for support. She testified that Shed tried to establish paternity when Mason was born but couldn't afford to fight Garrett's expensive lawyers, and Shed been raising Mason alone for 3 years, without receiving a single dollar or even any acknowledgement from his father. Brianna brought photos of Mason, and the resemblance to Garrett was undeniable, and when Simone asked if Garrett had ever provided any support, Brianna's response was simple and powerful. Never. Not once. Not a dollar, not a visit, nothing. My son doesn't even know his father exists. Bradford tried to discredit her during cross-examination, suggesting she was lying or mistaken or looking for money now that Garrett had gotten some publicity, but Brianna held firm, saying, "I don't want his money now. I just want the truth known about what kind of person he really is." Simone then called Kelsey Zimmerman, who corroborated her affair with Garrett during his marriage to me, showing additional evidence including a video Shed recorded on her phone where Garrett told her he loved her and promised to leave me. The video was dated during the time I was undergoing fertility treatments, when I was getting hormone injections and going through the emotional roller coaster of trying to have a baby, and the cruelty of that timing wasn't lost on anyone in the courtroom. Kelsey's testimony established a pattern of systematic deception, showing that Garrett had been lying to everyone about everything for years. Then came the testimony that changed everything. Douglas Fletcher, a forensic accountant Simone had hired to trace Garrett's assets, took the stand and methodically laid out evidence of fraud that was so blatant it was almost shocking. He testified that Head found offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands containing over $300,000, money that had been transferred during my divorce proceedings with the help of my father Richard, who had power of attorney to handle the transfers. Douglas explained that this money should have been disclosed and divided during the divorce, that hiding it constituted fraud, and that my father's involvement made him a co-conspirator in a potentially criminal act. The courtroom erupted in whispered conversations, and Garrett looked panicked, leaning over to whisper urgently with Bradford Mills while his face turned red. My parents looked genuinely stunned, sitting in the gallery with their mouths open, and I got the impression they hadn't known the full extent of what Richard had helped Garrett do. Judge Pemberton called both attorneys to sidebar for a heated discussion that lasted nearly 10 minutes, and when they returned, the judge announced that she was referring the matter to the State Attorney General's office for criminal investigation into potential fraud. Bradford Mills requested an immediate recess to consult with his clients, and during the break I watched from across the corridor as my parents argued with Garrett in hushed but clearly angry voices. My father's face was bright red and he was jabbing his finger toward Garrett's chest, while my mother stood crying and shaking her head, and something in their unified front seemed to have fractured. When court reconvened after lunch, Bradford stood and made an announcement that shocked everyone. Brooke was withdrawing her lawsuit against me. He tried to frame it as not wanting to prolong the family's pain and focusing on what's best for Lily. But Judge Pemberton wasn't having any of it. She questioned Brooke directly under oath, asking if she'd known about Garrett's hidden assets, and Brooke stammered that she knew he had some savings but didn't know the details. The judge asked if Brooke had known about Mason, and Brooke said no, looking genuinely shocked and hurt by that revelation. Then Judge Pemberton asked the most damaging question. Had Brooke known that the lawsuit against me was being funded in part by money that had been fraudulently hidden from me during my divorce? Brooke started crying and said she didn't understand the financial details, that her parents had told her she deserved support for Lily, and had encouraged her to file the lawsuit without explaining where the money was coming from. Judge Pemberton delivered a statement from the bench that was absolutely scathing. She called the lawsuit frivolous and brought in bad faith, saying that it had wasted the court's time and resources on a claim that had no legal merit and was clearly motivated by personal animus rather than any genuine need. She ordered Brooke and my parents to pay all of my legal fees, which had run into tens of thousands of dollars, and she issued a restraining order preventing them from filing any further legal actions against me without prior court approval. She announced she was referring the financial fraud to the State Attorney General for criminal investigation and was ordering immediate paternity testing for Mason with full financial disclosure from Garrett for purposes of establishing child support. Looking directly at Garrett with obvious disgust, Judge Pemberton said, "You have defrauded multiple women and abandoned your children while claiming poverty. I am ordering you to submit to paternity testing for Mason Porter within 30 days, and upon establishment of paternity, you will be liable for 3 years of retroactive child support plus ongoing support going forward." Then she turned to my parents and said, "You enabled fraud against your own daughter and then used the proceeds of that fraud to sue her. You should be ashamed of yourselves." And the judgment in her voice was withering. Court was adjourned, the gavel came down, and I stood in shock as people filed out around me. It was over. I had won. But the cost had been absolutely everything. 3 months after the trial ended, I sat in my new apartment in Ballard, a 2-bedroom place with hardwood floors and big windows that let in natural light, and for the first time in over a year I felt something approaching peace. The legal fees it'd been awarded by the court had helped me move to a better place and rebuild my savings, and while money couldn't fix the emotional damage, it at least removed some of the financial stress that had been crushing me for months. Garrett was facing multiple lawsuits now, with Brianna's attorney taking her case pro bono after the publicity from my trial made it impossible for Garrett to hide anymore. Paternity had been established for Mason, and Garrett owed 3 years of back child support plus ongoing payments, and his hidden offshore accounts had been seized to pay what he owed. My father Richard had lost his financial advisor license after the investigation revealed Head helped other clients with questionable offshore transfers, not just Garrett, and he was facing potential criminal charges for fraud and money laundering. My mother Patricia had filed for legal separation, apparently not having known the full extent of Richard's involvement in the scheme, and Shed called me once for a brief, awkward conversation where she said, "I'm sorry," I didn't know, in a voice that sounded broken. Id responded, "You knew enough. You chose to believe them over me without ever asking for my side." And Patricia had no response to that. We hadn't spoken since, and I didn't expect we would again, at least not for a very long time. Brooke had moved to California with baby Lily, trying to start over somewhere away from the scandal and media attention, and Id heard through mutual acquaintances that she was in therapy, finally dealing with patterns of behavior that had been destructive her entire life. No apology had come, and I wasn't holding my breath for one, having learned that some people are fundamentally incapable of taking real responsibility for their actions, and some relationships can't be repaired no matter how much you might want them to be. I had grown unexpectedly close to Brianna and Mason, not as family exactly, but as survivors of the same predator, women who understood what it meant to be manipulated and abandoned by someone who was supposed to care about you. We met for coffee occasionally at a park where Mason could play, and Id watched with genuine happiness as Brianna's life improved with the child support she was finally receiving. Shed enrolled in a dental hygiene program at a community college, working toward a career that would give her and Mason real stability, and seeing her build something positive out of all that pain gave me hope that I could do the same. Kelsey Zimmerman had also become an unexpected friend, having been vilified online after her testimony brought accusations that she was a homewrecker and liar looking for attention. I understood that kind of attack intimately, having lived through it myself, and Wed bonded over our shared experience of being blamed for men's choices. Simone remained my closest friend, the one person who'd stood by me through absolutely everything. And Id learned that chosen family is often stronger than blood family because it's built on loyalty and respect rather than obligation. Therapy with Dr. Helen Wu continued weekly, helping me work through layers of betrayal trauma and rebuild my ability to trust people, and I was learning that healing isn't linear, that some days I felt strong and other days I felt destroyed all over again, but that both responses were valid and part of the process. I'd started dating again cautiously, meeting a teacher named Owen through a mutual friend, and he was kind and patient and made me laugh in ways I'd forgotten were possible. We were taking things slowly, no rush or pressure, just seeing where it might go, and for the first time in years I felt like I might be capable of letting someone in again without constantly waiting for betrayal. My career at Seattle Children's Hospital had actually flourished during all of this, and I'd been promoted to charge nurse, a position that came with more responsibility but also more respect and autonomy. The work gave me purpose and reminded me daily that I was good at something, that I had value beyond my relationships, and helping sick children heal was meaningful in ways that nothing else in my life had been. There was something ironic about helping other people's children recover, while my own inner child was still healing from wounds that might never fully close. Looking back on everything, I realized I'd learned some hard truths about human nature and family and survival. I learned that standing up for yourself often means losing people who only valued your silence, that family can be your biggest betrayers, that the truth matters even when it's painful, and that you can survive things you thought would destroy you. The lawsuit had been meant to break me, to force me into submission and make me accept their narrative that I was the problem. But instead, it had freed me from people who saw me as an obligation rather than a person, from the exhausting need for approval from people who would never give it, from a version of myself that tried to make everyone happy at the expense of my own dignity. Sometimes I still felt angry, grieving the family I'd thought I had, mourning the years I'd wasted trying to be good enough for people who would never appreciate it. But mostly, I felt peace. I'd told my truth in that courtroom, it had been heard and validated, and I'd fought back and won not just the legal battle but the battle for my own sense of worth and dignity. I wasn't the person Wad stood in that courthouse hallway 9 months ago, terrified and alone, clutching evidence that would blow up my entire world. I'd walked through fire and emerged fundamentally changed, scarred but stronger, and the scars were proof of survival rather than evidence of weakness. My phone buzzed with a text from Owen. "Dinner tomorrow? Ill cook." And I smiled as I typed back, "Perfect." Life was moving forward, not the life I'd planned when I was young and naive and believed that love and family were simple things built on trust and loyalty, but maybe something better. This new life was built on truth, on self-respect, on boundaries that I enforced without guilt, and on chosen family who'd proven their loyalty through actions rather than just words. The people who'd hurt me would face their own consequences, deal with their own karma, and I didn't need to carry their burdens anymore, or waste energy hoping they'd change or apologize or finally see what they'd done to me. As the sun set over Puget Sound, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, I sat on my balcony and felt something I hadn't felt in over a year: hope. Not the naive hope of before that assumed everyone was fundamentally good and that family would always protect you, but the hard-won hope of someone who'd been broken and rebuilt herself piece by piece. It was the knowledge that I could survive anything because I'd already survived the worst betrayal imaginable, and whatever came next, I would face it as myself, flawed and strong and finally, blessedly free. That was enough. I was enough. And for the first time in my life, I truly believed it. So, what would you do if you were in my situation? Would you have fought back or tried to forgive for the sake of family? Drop your thoughts in the comments because I'd love to hear different perspectives on this. And if this story resonated with you or you know someone who needs to hear it, please share it with them because sometimes we all need to know we're not alone in our struggles. Don't forget to hit that like button if you appreciated my honesty, and subscribe to this channel for more real stories about surviving betrayal and coming out stronger on the other side. Thank you so much for listening to my story and for all your support through this journey. I hope that whatever battles you're facing, you find the strength to stand up for yourself and the courage to walk away from people who don't value you. Stay strong, protect your peace, and remember that you deserve better than people who make you feel small. Until next time, take care of yourselves.